Thank you once more to the mentees for your presentations. Up next, we have the incredible Professor Lisa Cook from the Michigan State University and the wonderful Professor Trevon Logan of the Ohio State University, here to have a candid discussion of their personal and professional paths, the barriers faced and opportunities encountered, and their vision for the profession. Dr. Lisa Cook is a professor in the Department of Economics and in International Relations at Michigan State University. As the first Marshall Scholar from Spelman College, she received a second BA from Oxford University in philosophy, politics, and economics before getting a PhD in economics from UC Berkeley. Professor Cook served in the White House as a senior economist at the Council of Economic Advisors under President Obama. She also served as the president of the National Economics Association and currently serves as the director of the AEA Summer Training Program. Her current research interests include economic growth and development, financial institutions and markets, and economic history. Professor Cook is also a polyglot. She speaks English, French, Russian, Spanish, and Wolof. And Professor Trevon Logan is the Hazel C. Youngberg Distinguished Professor of Economics at The Ohio State University. He is a research associate at the NBER, as well as an affiliate of the Criminal Justice Research Center at The Ohio State University. Prior to this, he held visiting appointments at Princeton University and the University of Michigan. Professor Logan specializes in economic history, economic demography, and applied microeconomics, and serves on multiple editorial boards. He holds a BS in economics from the University of Wisconsin-Madison, a master's in economics, a master's in demography, and a PhD in economics from UC Berkeley. And so for the audience, after both Professor Cook and Professor Logan present, we will have a question and answer session if we have time. So if you have any questions you'd like to ask our speakers, please write them in the Q&A function below. Okay, Professor Cook, you can go ahead and unmute yourself and take it away.
Terrific. Great to see you all. I will just share my screen now.
Awesome, we can
Okay.
see you.
All right, great. So sorry for that delay. In any case, I am delighted that the organizers invited me to give the keynote address, or the first keynote address, for the current and future state of economics in 2020. It is the Researching Color Foundation's inaugural conference, and it is hosted by Princeton University. So I would say that my journey in economics is represented by my paper that I wrote recently that you might have heard about. And it is a paper published in the Journal of Economic Growth in 2014, Violence in Economic Activity, Evidence from African American Patents, 1870 to 1940. Here's a bit about the paper in case you haven't heard about it. So this is the summary of the major findings. I looked at African American inventors and other patentees in the US Patent Office. And this was from the period 1870 to 1940. And noticed that there was a divergence in patenting, in the direction of patenting among African American and other inventors. So the main findings of the paper are that violence diminishes innovation and economic activity with persistent effects. 1899 is still the peak year for patenting per capita for African Americans. Lynchings affect patents for African Americans significantly. Segregation laws hurt the most valuable patents at the time, electrical patents, and the missing patents are equivalent to those of a medium-sized European country at the time. That would have been between 1870 and 1940. Further, if we're extrapolating to today, what we see is that if the violence that was visited upon African American inventors had been imposed on the white inventors in the data set, we would have had much more volatile, innovative outcomes, and that would suggest much lower business investment, which would also suggest much lower long-run economic growth and much lower growth at the time. And with respect to violence and its impact on economic growth, the paper suggests that you want to stop the first lynching or the first episode of extreme violence because it has the greatest impact. So what was the motive for this paper? It was a purely macro question stemming from my dissertation research on Russia. And I was interviewing both bankers and entrepreneurs to figure out how credit markets were evolving in post-Soviet Russia. And one question came up all the time, and it was, why doesn't innovation come to Russia? And I didn't have a good answer. That's not exactly what I was studying. I was studying financial markets and I was studying entrepreneurship in Russia. So I didn't have a good answer, but this question stuck with me. So in my earliest inquiries about a potential historical experiment that could elucidate this question, I encountered suggestions by senior women in the field that if I focused on patents by Black people, I would never get tenure. So I think that this was due to the segregation, just in general, of the population of people in the United States, the segregation of economists from other social sciences, and the segregation of economists within economics. It also, to me, spoke to a lack of imagination, and I'll say more about that in just a moment. I think there was also a colonial attitude about research related to Black people and other people of color, that it didn't make much sense to study Black patentees because I was too close to it because I am African American. I think that's been a perspective that's been often articulated by Black economists. There were unchallenged myths and fundamental misunderstandings about African Americans just in the process of economic research. For example, I was told that all the patents would be agricultural and they would be all by Jamaicans before I even got started investigating patentees who were African American. And that turns out not to be true, by the way. There was also an ignorance of American history and African Americans' contributions to it. The only inventors I found that people knew were George Washington Carver and Madam C.J. Walker. And notably, this inquiry started about 100 years after they were active in invention and inquiring inventions. The paper took 10 years to publish. So with early cues from enthusiastic Nobel laureates, Milton Friedman, Ken Arrow, and George Akerlof, and later from Paul Romer, I sent this paper based on the research I just showed you to the top 5 economics journals. The referees had some questions about economics and especially econometrics, but they also had some other strange questions like, what is a former slave? So I thought after 3 or 4 sets of referee reports, wow, this is a really deep ignorance of US history. But that didn't matter, I had to inform them. So I wound up writing very long referee reports that were about US history, not about the econometrics and not about the economics. It seemed as though there was an unwillingness in general to believe that anything having to do with Black Americans was generalizable, of general interest, and could inform our understanding of economics, especially macroeconomics and economic growth. And I find that this sentiment exists still today. I have friends who are working on Native Americans. They're telling a fundamental economic story, and they have been told by journals that this has to do with Native Americans and is therefore not of general interest. I would beg to differ. So why did I persist? First of all, I said to myself, if I don't do this research, who will? Clearly, there are holes in the literature. I had the tools and the imagination to fill these holes in the literature. Fundamentally, as an economist, I wanted to make an original contribution to the field and increase our understanding of the most fundamental economic principles and assumptions. And this is something that I was challenging in the paper with respect to innovation. Where does it come from? The conventional wisdom was that having intellectual property rights was enough, protecting intellectual property was enough. And what I was saying was that that's not enough. Personal security matters, the rule of law matters. There has to be infrastructure and scaffolding for invention and innovation to take place. There's a whole system. And I was challenging the wisdom of the day. So as was alluded to in the opening remarks by Chinamelu, Rama, and Chinekwu, representation matters. And discrimination hinders the free flow of ideas. And this was something that I wanted to fight against, that the free flow of ideas is being hindered by discrimination and the lack of imagination by my fellow economists. So what do we do about the current state of economics? I say we diversify the pipeline, sure. The AEA Summer Program, or the Research in Color Foundation, obviously, and the Sadie Collective, which they mentioned before, also college-based groups that aren't national but are on college campuses on the MSU campus. It's WWAMI, Women and Minorities in Economics. We should also address, though, the racial and ethnic climate in economics, which requires fundamental change. So this is the environment in which African Americans and people of color are operating. So this means hiring, citing, funding, promoting, tenuring, and promoting again Black people and other people of color, especially women. It also involves best practices, implementing best practices like being a good bystander. Don't allow people to say negative things about individuals or groups while you are standing there. You can be a good bystander, and this is true for anybody in the economics profession, true for anybody. You don't wait until after an incident happens and not say, that's wrong, you should take it back, that is not acceptable in this field. There are many best practices that the AEA has posted on its website that we can all embrace, and we don't have to wait for anybody to instruct us to embrace, but the climate, the toxic culture sometimes in economics has got to change. So thank you for your attention. Research in Color, thanks for this invitation and best of luck with the conference. I'm wishing you well at creating the change you would like to see in the world and in the economics profession. Let's talk more about economics, mentoring, etc. on Econ Twitter. I'm at Dr. Lisa D. Cook. Thank you.
Phenomenal. Thank you so much. 1 second. Awesome. Up next, we have Professor Trevon Logan. All right, Professor, you can take it away.
Thank you. And Lisa, don't go off mute because this will be a conversation between both of us. So I want to actually follow up on something that Lisa mentioned about that paper, because that project that Lisa was talking about actually gave you a series of papers that we've written together with another co-author of ours, John Parman, about Black names. And the point of this is to really show that when you begin doing this work and you confront these problems, you really should not give up, because there are some extreme positive externalities that come out of this work. So when Lisa was beginning this process, and it was a 10-year process to publish this paper, Lisa and I began talking about the research project and pieces of the research project. And there were two really important things that happened inside of there. And they go to really important points about how mentoring works, how peer mentoring works, how friendships in the profession work, and how this can actually have an impact on the research community. The very first part that we began talking about was Lisa had encountered from referees a difficulty in them believing that these acts of violence had measurable effects and that the patent results were in fact anomalous, that it was something to do with the way that patenting operated, which would explain why the results were as strong as they were. And I happened to be at that time on a committee at a university in Columbus, Ohio, talking about historical African-American newspapers. And what I found was that there was a national data source of the dates when these Black newspapers began, which could tell us, for example, whether or not there was a relationship between newspapers starting for African Americans and racial violence. I had no use for that information myself, but I knew someone who did, who was Lisa, who added it to the paper. And this is one of the things that helped the paper to be published, is that there was an additional source of evidence about the effects of racial violence on African Americans' needs to communicate with each other, which could be seen by evidence in newspaper publishing. So this was an important empirical relationship that was the first of its kind to be discovered. So the lesson from that in mentoring is talk about your research projects to your friends who are not in the field. I'm not a macroeconomist. I'm not an industrial organization economist, but knowing something about this allowed me to actually go through my network and find other pieces of information that were actually helpful. And Lisa has, of course, been the same to me throughout my career. The second aspect of this is that Lisa really downplays the significance of this work because patents do not have racial identifiers on them. So it's one piece of information when you think about Black patentees. It is not as if you can download a data set and then just sort by race and find all of the African Americans who are inventing. So what Lisa had done to find Black inventors was construct a Black names index from the United States Census, and then use that name index, this historical Black names index, to try to find Black patentees. It turns out that that name index did not work to identify Black patentees. There was additional historical archival research that Lisa needed to do to find those Black patentees. But Lisa was convinced that she had found a Black naming pattern among African Americans that would precede the civil rights movement. And I remember very famously, and Lisa, to her credit, does not tease me about this too often, I said Lisa was wrong, that there was no narrative evidence that there was an African American naming pattern, and that she was absolutely incorrect. And in fact, if she was right, then some data that John Parman and I were using from death certificates, where we had several million death certificates, could be used to confirm such a naming pattern. So as an attempt, really we were playing around and seeing, for example, if we could find anything from this. We looked upon a historical fact, and in fact, a fact that no one had recognized before, that there was a historical naming pattern among African Americans that preceded the civil rights movement. Now, the publication of that result is its own story that we won't tell you because you already heard a story today, but that is an outgrowth of this research as well, and a very important outgrowth of this research as well. Not only does Lisa answer an important economic question that tells us something about heterogeneity within nations, about invention, innovation, and the rule of law and racial violence, but we were also able to uncover a historical fact which reorients the way that we think about African American history and culture. So the outgrowth of work that can sometimes be forged in very difficult circumstances and in disbelief can actually give rise to a body of work that is seen and judged well outside of its field. So never lose sight of the fundamental academic enterprise that you're entering into. I do want to close with 3 words of advice for both mentors and for those going into the profession. And before I say that, I really want to say I'm very, very excited about what the Research in Color Foundation is doing here with this program, and it's very exciting. The first piece of advice is that you're working in 3 different areas. There is the academic pedagogical approach of economics, right, which is as a discipline the way that they feel and orient to the questions that they ask and how we do what we do. There is the research of economics, which uses many times that approach, but also takes in some other sorts of pieces to ask and answer questions about the world. The third part of this, where a lot of mentoring is needed, is the profession of economics, which is the type of personalities that the profession reveres and responds to, and the way that it conducts its business. You will need mentoring in all three of these phases, but most importantly, it is going to be navigating the profession. To that, I have three things to offer. The first is that you are seeing things as they are. A good mentor or a good friend in the profession will very first empathize with you, not act in disbelief. It would be a very different relationship that Lisa and I would have as friends if she did not believe me when I brought things to her about the profession, or if I did not believe her. I've seen the referee reports and understand what she had to go through, and empathizing with her is one of the things that allowed her to persist in this, because she was seeing a reality. It was a disturbing reality, but it was very true. The second is that you must ground yourself in things that are important to you. If you're fundamentally asking an important question that you value, you will continue to make progress and you will have an impact. The economics profession may or may not see the value of what you are doing, but I can guarantee you that the rest of the world will. And that is very, very important. The third is, it is entirely okay, and in fact, in some instances for self-preservation necessary, to move forward. And what that can mean is seeking not necessarily to convince the powers that be in the profession, but to convince those who are willing to be convinced, and simply move on and to make your progress that way. That's really, really, really important. For mentors, I offer the following advice. The first is not to defend the indefensible. There are things in this profession which are still disturbing, and unfortunately, as the director of the AEA's mentoring program, I hear more often than not that one of the things that is a stress point in mentoring relationships is when a mentor immediately moves to defend an action, an activity, or an experience of someone who is junior in the profession. The first response should be to listen and to empathize, not to defend someone. The second is to understand that everyone's experience in the profession is unique. And for people who come from underrepresented groups, they can experience the same individual very differently than someone else may experience them. That's an important and sad reality of the economics profession, but one that we have to acknowledge if we're going to make progress. I think it's important to find networks and to solicit feedback from those who are fundamentally in support of your position. And that is the best way of forging and moving ahead. Thank you.